The grand halls of the Montgomery estate were filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the murmur of hushed conversations. The engagement party of Victor Montgomery, heir to the powerful Montgomery Empire, was nothing short of spectacular. The room was adorned with gold and white decor, and every guest in attendance was someone of status, wealth, or power. But Victor felt nothing. He stood near the balcony, swirling a glass of whiskey, his sharp eyes scanning the room. This was supposed to be his night, the night he celebrated his engagement to a woman he had never met until a month ago. Sophia Carter. A simple girl, his mother had said, someone pure, someone who wouldn't question the Montgomery family's legacy, someone who would obey. Victor took a slow sip of his drink, exhaling through his nose. He didn't believe in love, not in his world. Marriage was nothing but a business contract, a transaction that benefited both parties. He had agreed to this arrangement without a second thought. But the moment he had laid eyes on Sophia that evening, something had unsettled him. She was too poised, too calm, not nervous, not overwhelmed like he had expected. And that smile, the one she wore when introduced to guests, felt too perfect. Victor didn't trust perfection. His father's deep voice interrupted his thoughts. "Why are you standing here like a stranger at your own engagement?" Victor turned his head slightly. Robert Montgomery was a man who commanded fear and respect wherever he went. His voice alone could silence a room. "Just getting some air," Victor muttered. Robert exhaled. "You should be standing with your fiancée." He motioned to Sophia, who was gracefully chatting with one of the senators in attendance. "She's well-mannered, well-spoken. She'll make an excellent Montgomery wife." Victor's jaw tightened. "She's a stranger." "Not for long," his father said coolly. "You'll marry her in 2 weeks, and then you'll have all the time in the world to get familiar with her." Victor didn't argue. In the Montgomery family, arguing was pointless. His gaze flickered back to Sophia. Who exactly had he just agreed to marry? The wedding night. The massive master bedroom of the Montgomery estate was dimly lit with soft candlelight. The air smelled of roses and expensive perfume. Everything was designed for perfection, for intimacy, but there was no warmth between them. Victor loosened his tie, watching as Sophia sat by the vanity, removing the delicate earrings she had worn throughout the evening. "You've been quiet all night," he finally said, breaking the silence. She met his eyes in the mirror, her expression unreadable. "So have you." Victor let out a quiet chuckle. "I don't know anything about you." Sophia turned slowly, standing up. "What would you like to know?" Victor studied her carefully. "Why did you agree to this marriage?" Her lips curled slightly. "Why did you?" Victor exhaled sharply. "Because my father wanted me to." She tilted her head slightly. "Then we have something in common." That answer sent a flicker of something through him. Doubt, curiosity, maybe even suspicion. Victor stepped closer, his voice lowering. "Who are you, Sophia?" A beat of silence. Then she whispered the words that would change everything. "My name isn't Sophia Carter." Victor's entire body tensed. The room suddenly felt colder. His voice was sharp. "Then who are you?" Sophia exhaled, her fingers tightening against the vanity's edge. And then, she finally said it. "My real name is Isabella Romano." Victor felt his breath hitch. Romano, a name that should have been wiped from existence, a name his father had erased. And now, standing before him, was the last living heir to the family his father had destroyed. His bride, his enemy. His entire world was about to turn upside down. Victor's body went rigid, his mind racing to process the words that had just left Isabella's lips. Romano, a name that should not exist anymore. A name his father had erased from history. A family that had been wiped out years ago. Yet standing before him was the last surviving heir of that bloodline. His wife, his enemy. Victor's throat tightened. "You're lying." Isabella met his gaze, unflinching. "You already know I'm not." The room felt suffocatingly silent, the only sound the faint ticking of the antique clock against the wall. Victor's pulse hammered inside his chest, but he kept his face unreadable. "Why now?" he demanded. "Why wait until after the wedding to tell me?" her hands curled into fists at her sides. Because I needed to be inside the Montgomery family first. Victor's breath came slow and controlled, but inside he was spiraling. So what is this? He gestured between them. Revenge? Her lips parted slightly, but she hesitated, and that single second of hesitation told him everything. Victor let out a sharp breath, stepping away, his hands clenched into fists. You used me. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, Isabella whispered. And for the first time, her voice held something real, not calculation, not control, but something raw, something uncertain. Victor scoffed. And what exactly was supposed to happen, Isabella? His voice was edged with ice. Were you planning to kill me? Or were you waiting for the perfect moment to destroy my family from within? She flinched, her fingers tightening against the fabric of her dress. I don't know anymore, she admitted almost too quietly. Victor's jaw clenched. You don't know? He repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. She swallowed hard. I had a plan, she whispered, but then I met you. Victor hated the way his heart reacted to those words, the way it twisted painfully inside his chest. He wanted to believe she was lying, but something in her eyes told him she wasn't. He let out a hollow laugh, running a hand through his hair. So what now? You expect me to just accept this and go to bed like nothing happened? She didn't answer, because they both knew. This changed everything. Victor's mind raced, flashing back to everything he thought he knew about his father. Had Robert Montgomery really destroyed an entire family just to eliminate a rival? Victor had always known his father was ruthless, but this? He took a slow step forward, his voice quieter now, but sharper. Tell me the truth, Isabella. She lifted her chin slightly. I already have. No, Victor said darkly. Not all of it. A flicker of something passed through her gaze. Hesitation, fear. Then just as she opened her mouth to speak, the bedroom door burst open. Victor spun around, his instincts flaring. Standing in the doorway, dressed in a crisp suit, his expression unreadable, was Robert Montgomery. Victor's blood ran cold. Behind Robert stood three of his personal guards, their stance tense, their eyes fixed on Isabella. For the first time that night, she looked truly afraid. Robert stepped inside slowly, his gaze flickering between the two of them, before settling on Isabella. Well, he said, his voice smooth, collected, but carrying a dangerous edge. I was wondering how long it would take before you told him the truth. Victor's stomach twisted violently. His father knew. He had known all along, and that meant this wasn't a warning. This was a trap. The room felt like it had shrunk, the walls pressing in as the weight of Robert Montgomery's presence suffocated the air. Victor's pulse pounded in his ears as he watched his father take slow, deliberate steps into the room. The three guards behind him stood motionless, their expressions unreadable, but their presence alone was enough to send a silent warning. Victor's fists clenched at his sides. His father had known, not just about Isabella's real identity, but about everything. The arranged marriage, the carefully curated illusion, it had all been a game, and Victor had been nothing more than a pawn in it. Robert's lips curled into a faint smirk as he studied Isabella. You've done well, he mused, his voice smooth, measured. I must admit, I wasn't sure how far you'd take this little deception of yours, but you played the role beautifully. Isabella's body was rigid, her face unreadable, but Victor could see it, the slight tremble in her hands, the way her breath had quickened. His father terrified her. Victor stepped forward, placing himself between them. You knew, he said, his voice dangerously low. You knew who she was this entire time, and you still let this happen. Robert's gaze shifted to his son, amusement flickering in his eyes. Of course I knew, he said. You think I would let just anyone marry into this family without knowing every detail of their past? His smirk faded, his voice turning cold. The real question, son, is why you didn't know. Victor's jaw tightened. His father was testing him, searching for weakness, waiting for him to falter. But Victor wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Why now, he asked, his voice steady. Why show your hand tonight? Robert sighed as if he were discussing business rather than the exposure of a decades-old massacre. He glanced at Isabella, his expression unreadable. Because the game is over. He nodded toward his guards. Take her! Everything inside Victor snapped. The guards moved forward, their hands reaching for Isabella, but Victor acted before he could think. With lightning reflexes, he grabbed one of the guards by the collar, yanking him back before landing a brutal punch across his jaw. The man stumbled, crashing into the dresser, knocking over the expensive decor. Before the second guard could react, Isabella twisted out of his grip, driving her elbow into his ribs before kicking him backward. Robert didn't even flinch as chaos erupted in the room. He merely stepped back, watching with detached amusement as his men struggled against his own son. Victor barely dodged a hit from the third guard before slamming his fist into the man's throat, sending him crashing to the floor, gasping for breath. Isabella wasn't as lucky. One of the guards had recovered quickly, grabbing her by the wrist and twisting it behind her back. She let out a sharp gasp of pain, her body jerking as she tried to break free. Victor saw red. With a force he didn't even know he possessed, he grabbed the closest glass vase from the table and smashed it against the guard's head. The man crumpled, releasing Isabella as he collapsed onto the carpet. Victor turned, his chest heaving, his breath ragged as he faced his father. Robert was smiling. You've changed, Robert mused, his voice calm, unfazed. You never used to fight back. Victor's hands curled into fists. You never gave me a reason to. His father exhaled, glancing at the unconscious men on the floor, before stepping toward the door. You're making a mistake, son, he warned. She isn't your future. She's a loose end that should have been taken care of years ago. Victor felt Isabella's trembling hand grip his forearm, but his eyes never left his father's. You don't get to decide that anymore, Victor said, his voice like steel. Robert's gaze darkened. Is that so? Victor nodded. Yes. His father studied him for a long moment before letting out a quiet chuckle. Then I suppose I'll have to remind you what happens to those who betray me? He turned without another word, disappearing through the door, leaving behind the promise of war. Victor exhaled shakily, running a hand through his hair as the weight of everything settled over him. Isabella gripped his wrist, forcing him to look at her. He's not going to let this go, Victor, she whispered. We have to leave. Now. Victor met her gaze, his own resolve hardening. He had spent his entire life following Robert Montgomery's rules. But tonight, he had broken them, and there was no turning back. Victor's chest was heaving, his mind racing as Isabella's grip tightened around his wrist. The realization hit him like a freight train. They were no longer safe in this house. His father had never tolerated betrayal, and now Victor had just committed the ultimate sin. He had chosen her over the Montgomery Empire, and Robert would never forgive that. Isabella swallowed hard, her voice low and urgent. Victor, we don't have time. He's going to send more men. Victor dragged a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. He knew she was right. His father wasn't the type to give warnings. He eliminated threats immediately, and in Robert Montgomery's eyes, Isabella was a threat. But now, so was Victor. Victor turned to her, his mind shifting into survival mode. We need to leave, but we can't just run. He'll track us. We need to hit him before he hits us. Isabella's brows furrowed. What are you saying? Victor grabbed his phone from the bedside table and swiftly dialed a number. The moment the call connected, he spoke. Get me the files on every offshore account under my father's name. I don't care what it takes. Find them. The voice on the other end hesitated. Sir, that's highly confidential. If your father finds out, he will. Victor cut in, his voice sharp. And by then, it won't matter. He ended the call, shoving the phone into his pocket before turning back to Isabella. She was watching him carefully. What are you doing? Victor exhaled. Ending this. A flicker of something passed through her eyes. Relief? Admiration? He wasn't sure, but before he could say anything else, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Victor's stomach twisted. Robert wasn't wasting time. Without thinking, he grabbed Isabella's hand and pulled her toward the hidden side exit near the dressing room. Come on! They slipped out just as the door to their bedroom burst open again. More men, more of his father's enforcers. Victor didn't look back. They ran, down the hall, through the private staircase, out into the cold night air. The mansion loomed behind them like a fortress, but Victor knew it wasn't home anymore. Not for him, not for Isabella, not after tonight. They drove in silence, speeding down the deserted highway, the city lights a distant glow in the rearview mirror. Isabella sat beside him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression unreadable. Victor's grip on the wheel tightened. "Say it," she turned to him, confused. "Say what?" "You told me you had a plan," Victor muttered. "Before all of this, before we ended up here." His jaw clenched. "What was it?" Isabella exhaled slowly, staring ahead. "I was going to take down your father's empire, piece by piece." Victor swallowed hard. She looked at him then, her voice softer. "I never expected you to be on my side." Victor let out a humorless chuckle. "Neither did I." A beat of silence passed between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Then Isabella reached for something inside her coat, a small black USB drive. Victor's eyes flickered toward it. "What's that?" She held it between her fingers. "Evidence." His grip on the wheel tightened. "Evidence of what?" Isabella turned to him fully, her expression serious, unshaken. "Of everything your father has ever done." Victor inhaled sharply. If that was true, then they weren't just running. They were about to start a war. Victor gripped the steering wheel tighter, his mind spinning as he stared at the USB drive in Isabella's hand. "Evidence of everything your father has ever done." The weight of those words settled over him like a storm cloud. He had known his father was ruthless, had always suspected his power wasn't built on clean business deals, but he had never questioned it. Not really, not until now. "What's on it?" His voice was low, controlled, but inside he was burning. Isabella kept her gaze steady. "Financial records, wire transfers, illegal offshore accounts, blackmail. Everything your father has done to silence people, erase them, destroy them. It's all here." She tapped the USB against her palm. "This is the proof that can take him down." Victor exhaled sharply, his thoughts colliding. "And you were planning to use this?" She hesitated. "Before? Yes, I was going to leak it. Let the world see the truth." He swallowed, staring at the road ahead. "And now?" Isabella didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked at him, really looked at him, as if searching for something in his expression. Finally, she whispered, "Now, I don't know." Victor let out a humorless chuckle. "Why? Because you didn't expect to fall for me?" Silence. His chest tightened. He didn't know if he wanted to hear her say it. She turned her face away, staring out of the window. "I didn't expect you to be different." Victor clenched his jaw, his pulse hammering. He wasn't different, not yet, but he wanted to be. He glanced at the drive again. This tiny device had the power to bring down everything his father had built. It also had the power to destroy Victor, his family name, his entire legacy. And yet, for the first time in his life, he didn't care. His father deserved this. His father had built an empire on blood and betrayal. Victor wasn't going to be a part of it anymore. He pulled the car onto a secluded side road, turning off the headlights before shifting into park. The night stretched in front of them, quiet and eerie, but the tension inside the car was suffocating. Victor turned to Isabella. "If we do this," he said, his voice dead serious, "we do it right. We don't just leak the files and hope it works. We dismantle everything he has, every connection, every ally. We make sure he can't recover." Isabella's lips parted slightly. "You're serious?" He met her gaze without hesitation. "If we do this, we do it together." A flicker of something passed through her expression, something like relief. Then she handed him the drive. Victor took it, feeling its weight against his palm. It was small, but the power it held was massive. He inhaled deeply. This was it. The moment he officially turned against his father. There was no going back now. He started the car again, determination burning in his veins. "Where are we going?" Isabella asked. Victor didn't hesitate. To burn the Montgomery Empire to the ground. The sun had barely begun to rise when Victor and Isabella arrived at a hidden safe house on the outskirts of the city. The small, secluded building was nothing like the grandeur of the Montgomery estate. No chandeliers, no marble floors, no men in suits watching their every move. Just silence. But silence meant safety. For now. Victor shut the car off and turned to Isabella. "We don't have much time before my father realizes what we're doing." She nodded, gripping the USB drive tightly in her hands. "We need to move fast. Once we start leaking the files, it's over for him. But we have to be smart." Victor ran a hand down his face, his mind racing through every possible outcome. Robert Montgomery had spent decades eliminating threats. He wouldn't go down without a fight. If they wanted to bring him down, they had to take everything from him first. Inside the safe house, Victor immediately got to work. He connected the USB drive to a secured laptop and scanned through the files. His heart pounded as he saw the proof laid out in front of him. Offshore accounts, illegal deals, bribery transactions, hit orders. It was worse than he expected. "This isn't just business corruption," he muttered, scrolling through the documents. "This is criminal on every level. If this goes public, my father won't just lose his empire. He'll go to prison for the rest of his life." Isabella stepped behind him, her voice steady but laced with years of buried pain. "That's exactly what he deserves." Victor's jaw tightened. She was right. For too long, he had been blind to the monster his father really was. And now he was going to be the one to end him. With a few swift keystrokes, he began encrypting and sending the files to multiple news outlets, law enforcement agencies, and trusted allies who had no ties to the Montgomery family. Within minutes, the entire Montgomery empire would start crumbling from the inside. A single notification popped up on the screen. "Files successfully sent." Victor exhaled sharply, staring at the screen. It was done. Isabella placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing lightly. "It's over, Victor." But before he could respond, his phone buzzed violently. Robert Montgomery. Victor stared at the screen, his pulse pounding. He already knew. Without hesitation, he answered. "Son." Robert's voice came through, eerily calm. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Victor didn't blink. "I've ended you." Silence. Then a quiet, dark chuckle. "You think this is over?" Victor leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. "No, Father. You think you're untouchable, but the world is about to see who you really are." A pause. Then Robert's voice lowered to a deadly whisper. "You always were the biggest disappointment in this family." Victor's chest tightened, but he forced himself to stay steady. "And you were never a father to me." He ended the call. Isabella watched him carefully. "He's going to retaliate." Victor nodded, his expression unreadable. Let him try. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid. He had chosen his side, and there was no turning back. 1 week later, the headlines were everywhere. Billionaire Robert Montgomery under federal investigation. Criminal empire exposed. Montgomery fortune frozen. Illegal assets discovered in offshore accounts. A dynasty falls. Will Robert Montgomery face prison? Victor sat in a quiet cafe, sipping his coffee as he watched the news unfold. The Montgomery empire had collapsed faster than even he expected. His father had tried to cover his tracks, but it was too late. The world knew the truth now. Isabella slid into the seat across from him, a faint smile on her lips. "It's really over." Victor met her gaze, his grip tightening around his coffee cup. "Not yet." She raised an eyebrow. "Robert's finished. His empire's gone." Victor exhaled. "He still has connections. People who are loyal to him. People who might try to fix this." Her expression turned serious. "Then what do we do?" Victor set his cup down, leaning forward. "We make sure he never comes back." Isabella's lips parted slightly, then curled into a knowing smirk. They had destroyed the Montgomery empire. Now it was time to bury it forever. Victor sat in the dimly lit cafe, his fingers wrapped around the warm ceramic of his coffee cup. The television mounted on the wall played news coverage of the Montgomery empire's downfall, the same story running on every major network. Once a titan in the business world, Robert Montgomery is now facing multiple federal charges, including financial fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. His assets have been frozen, his company is in ruins, and sources confirmed that he may be facing life in prison. Victor exhaled, his chest rising and falling in steady control. It's over. For the first time in his life, he was free. Across the table, Isabella stirred her tea, watching him carefully. He hasn't reached out again. Victor shook his head. No calls, no messages, no threats. He paused, meeting her gaze. But we both know he's not the type to accept defeat. Isabella's lips pressed together. Do you think he'll try to rebuild? Victor took a slow sip of his coffee, considering the possibility. His father had spent decades crushing his enemies, rising to the top with ruthless precision. A man like that didn't just disappear. But then again, neither did Victor. If he tries, Victor said slowly, I'll be ready. A small smirk played at Isabella's lips. So, what happens now? Victor leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. For the first time, he had no script to follow, no orders to obey. His entire life had been about preserving the Montgomery name, but now that name meant nothing. And that was exactly how he wanted it. I don't know, he admitted, but whatever it is, it'll be on my terms. Isabella studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good. A comfortable silence settled between them, the weight of the past few weeks finally starting to lift. Victor looked down at his hands. They had been trained to build, to control, to dominate, but now for the first time, they were his own. He glanced at Isabella. Maybe their story hadn't started with trust or love. Maybe it had started with lies and revenge. But right now, none of that mattered. She was here, and they were free. Victor smirked. Let's get out of here. Isabella raised an eyebrow. And go where? He threw a few bills onto the table, standing up. Anywhere but here. She hesitated for only a second before smiling, sliding her hand into his. Together, they walked out into the city, leaving the past behind them. No more Montgomery name, no more legacy to protect. Just Victor and Isabella, and whatever came next. For the first time, they weren't running, they were living.